Thanks, Charnel. And welcome to everyone joining us today. It might be too cold yet to go out and do serious vegetable gardening, but it's always fun to talk about it and to start doing some prep. As Charnel said, I'm the Pets and Wildlife columnist and garden writer for the Bay Area News Group. I've been with the paper. This is my 34th year. If I make it one more year, I heard I get a pony, but I'm not sure. I've taken Master Gardener training, but I am not a Master Gardener because I don't do the important volunteer work that the Master Gardeners do. But we're very lucky today to have a Master Gardener, an official hand-stamped Master Gardener, Mike Corby. Mike, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Joan, and thanks for letting me join you guys this morning. So I actually got my interest in Master Gardening when I retired from business back, a good 10 years or so ago. And my wife and I were living in Calaveras County at the time. And so I got interested in gardening and found that there was a Master Gardener program for Calaveras County. And we went through the requisite training and began our gardening retirement careers there in Calaveras. A few years later, we moved back here to the Bay Area, and we were fortunate enough that the Contra Costa Master Gardeners allowed us to join them here, and we've been quite active since then. And I think one of my favorite parts of the Master Gardening is working at our demonstration garden that is at the corner of Shadelands and Wiggett in Walnut Creek. And it's just been a delight to work with the people there. The amount that I have learned about gardening, and most of it, fortunately, being very much hands-on at that garden. And if you ever have a chance, we are open to the public on Wednesdays out there, beginning in April. And it's a great opportunity to come out and ask questions if you're close by and just visit it. It's really something quite to see, and it's a great way to ask questions of a lot of people that have a lot of great experience in terms of what's going on with your garden. So that's kind of where I am and why we're here today.
Great. Well, Mike is going to take us through some important prep work that we need to do before we get ready to start our gardens. So Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we're talking today. I admire what Joan had said. I think we're all starting to itch to get out into those gardens. We were sort of motivated a little bit by some incredibly fair weather over the past month, and so I know that I have blooms on trees all around me, and everything just is sort of yelling spring, and we want to get ready for that. And actually, this is a good time. It is too cold to be thinking about putting too many things in your garden. There are some cold weather vegetables that you can still do right now. A lot of your greens, cabbages, and things like that you can still plant, and they'll do fine for the next couple of months. But certainly those things that we all look forward to, like the tomatoes and the big ripe summer fruits, we're still a few months off on that. So, but in the meantime, thinking about your garden, and whether you're an experienced gardener, you've been doing this for a long time, or it's going to be new to you, I want to try and take you through some ideas that maybe haven't been discussed in the past in other presentations about garden prep. So obviously, one of the things that we would typically think about is where am I going to grow my garden? And if you've got a place already, that's great. And we'll talk about how you can actually get that prepared as well. If you don't have a spot, here's just a couple of bullet points, a couple of things to think about in terms of where you might want to put a garden around your property. First, pick a spot that's convenient, that's fairly closer to your kitchen, the better. Make sure it's a good sunny spot. Most summer veggies need lots of sunshine and a lot of hours of it. And obviously make sure that you got a spot that's fairly close to water. So as you think about that, you've got quite a few options. You can take and plant directly into the ground, like this photograph is showing here. And that certainly has worked well for a long, long time. But maybe your ground is really, really difficult to work with, or maybe you would prefer not to bend all the way to the ground. I know myself, as I continue to get older, the ground seems to get lower and lower. So one option here too is to go ahead and build raised beds similar to this photograph. Here's a way that you can raise that garden bed by a foot or so, and that's going to reduce the amount of bending that you need to do, the amount of stress on your back. If you can see on these beds here, they've actually got a convenient place that you could sit on and reach into the beds from. So, in either case here, just make sure that they're not too wide. You want to be able to reach them from either side, and that part is important. Another factor that has actually become incredibly popular in the last few years are these large metal tubs. And depending on where you live in the Bay Area, these can be a really good solution. They're fairly easy to bring in and to install. Make sure that you drill good drainage holes in the bottom, and usually just take a few bricks or some old cinder blocks to set them up on so they're not actually touching the soil underneath. But if you're in a cooler spot in the Bay Area, this metal liner warms the soil very quickly and provides more warmth for the plant roots. And so that's in itself can be a good thing. If you're in an area like I am in Central Contra Costa that tends to get very, very hot in the summertime, you might need to protect your plants a little bit more because they can actually become too warm. But another piece of this too, we have one of our master gardeners that uses these extensively in his backyard. And if you think about the sides of these, if you've had problems in the past with rodents getting into your garden, these are a great deterrent. The gophers and things of that nature cannot dig through the bottom and get into the planted area of your garden here, and rats are not able to climb up these walls because they're too slick. So either way, these make for a pretty good container that sort of all in one. They come in a lot of different sizes, and so more and more we're finding folks adopting these for their garden. And obviously you can put them in the sunnier spots that you have, or wherever it really works in your backyard. Some people find them a little industrial in the way that they look, and other people kind of like them as a funky sort of garden art. So I'll let you choose on that. And then there's a lot of things that you can grow even in a windowsill. So if you're in an apartment but you'd certainly like to have some cherry tomatoes, find a good sunny window and even use a small pot like this. And you'll find that you can grow quite a few herbs. You can grow some small veg plants in here, and they'll do just fine. So don't be discouraged. There's always a place somewhere around the house or in the garden that you're going to be able to grow some edibles this summer. So if you're thinking about planting in the ground, obviously just first and foremost is tidy things up. So if there's any existing plants, wood, or old debris on the ground, you kind of want to clear all that away, and you want to kind of make sure that that soil is is going to be easy for the roots and the plants to thrive in. And one of the most important things about looking at this is making sure that the ground is level. Plants don't like wet feet, and so making sure it's level is going to help with drainage. If you have irrigation that you're using, similar to this picture you see, check it. This is a good time to check it. That's one of the things, one of the tasks we have in our demonstration garden right now is checking the irrigation. And things happen, lines break, things of that nature. And so this is a good time to check and make sure that everything is functioning correctly. And then once you've got your bed fairly together, if you're not going to plant immediately, one of the things you might want to think about is putting mulch on top, some straw or something that's lightweight and easily movable, but that's going to suppress the weeds, because as we get these beds ready, that's some beautiful soil you're going to have there. The weeds are going to be more than happy to take advantage of that environment that you're creating for them. So, and if you're planting in containers, kind of the same rules of thumb apply. If there's debris and old stuff that's hanging around on the top of those containers, it's good. This is probably a good time to clean that off. Container gardens are typically, we use potting mixes, which are actually heavy in forest materials. So you'll find with any type of a container, whether it's the ones that we talked about here, or even some more decorative things like an old bathtub that I have down here for you, that material will begin to disintegrate, decompose, which is what it's supposed to do. But you might find that you want to top off those containers. And so getting some good aged compost and mixing that back in is going to be a good way to top off those containers, but also to begin to add nutrients back into that soil. Again, double check your irrigation if you do have irrigation to these containers, and you can even mulch containers. So those something to think about before you get your veggies planted. So, a lot of times when we talk about prep, we think about things like machinery and tools like rakes and hoes and shovels and things. But what I would like to start at was something that's a little more fundamental here. I want to start really with getting you to think about the soil itself, and what you can do with that soil. So, in this particular picture, one of the first things you can do is, grab a handful of the soil that you're going to be using for your plants and hold it up to your nose. How does it smell? It should smell earthy. It should smell fresh. And if it does, then, that's a good sign. That means that things are probably functioning the way they shouldn't. But if there are any off smells, then what we want to do is kind of restore the soil to where it's supposed to be. So, an interesting thing that a lot of times you don't really get an opportunity to think about or look at is, what is soil? What is it made of? Okay. And so this little pie chart here sort of breaks that out. So if I start here on the right-hand side, 45% of the soil is minerals. And what do I mean by minerals? Well, minerals are decomposed rock. This is what we oftentimes call parent material. So this is an inorganic material, but it's rocks, and those rocks play an important part. As they weather, they break down and they get smaller and smaller and smaller until we get to the soil particles that you have in your garden. The other portion here is organic material. This is everything from fallen leaves to old roots to microbes and fauna, insects and things. Anything that's basically living or once was alive in your soil is what's made up in this organic matter. And then, interestingly enough, 25% of your soil is air. And that air is important because roots actually breathe. Roots perform the respiration. So those microbes that we talked about and the roots of the plants require oxygen just like we do. And so it's important to have that available to them. And then the other 25% is water in the soil, which may not be surprising to you, but is actually a very critical component as well. And you know, as I became a master gardener, and I got very, very interested in soil and soil science. As I looked at this particular pie chart, one of the things that I found was quite interesting is that soil is actually 50% solid, and it's 50% of what we call pore space. And pore space are just those tiny little channels between the particles of solid matter that allow the air and the water and the roots to penetrate down into the soil. And it's something that a lot of times we don't think about, but it's a critical part of having good, healthy soil in your garden is that pore space here. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that and how you can make sure that that's functioning in your garden. And the other piece I kind of want to bring up here is the idea that soil is actually a living ecosystem. There is a whole world down here. If you've ever read anything from Dr. Elaine Ingram, she talks about the soil food web. And that's this whole little ecosystem that is functioning quite well in healthy soil. And it begins at the top with your plants, the photosynthesis they're doing, the roots that they're pushing down in through the soil layers. Think about things like centipedes, millipedes, earthworms that are burrowing through here. You may even have issues with things like moles and voles. Those aren't really the bad guys. They're not doing anything bad for the most part, especially with things like moles or eating grubs that are insects that will attack your roots. But then as we go deeper and we go smaller, you're going to keep finding smaller and smaller organisms living in here. Things like mites and nematodes down here around the root hairs of your plants. And even farther down, we have things like protozoa, fungus, and bacteria that are busy breaking down and mineralizing the elements that your plants need so that they can get the required food that they need. And speaking of that food, another piece of it here, you're probably familiar when you get a bag of fertilizer from the nursery or a hardware store, big box store, or wherever you get these things, that plants require nutrients. And so just like humans, there's a certain number of nutrients that plants need as well. And they're kind of broken out into two parts. There's macronutrients and there are micronutrients. And then if you were to break that a second time, things like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen actually come from air and water. But the remainder here, these 13 essential elements that we call them, come directly from the soil. So remember I talked about those minerals? Well, those minerals contain these elements and they're very, very important. And the difference between a macronutrient and a micronutrient has nothing to do with how important it is to the plant. All of these are equally important to a plant. And so even the smallest element here, if it's in short supply in your soil, can actually impede a plant's ability to thrive. But these are the 17 that you need and you want to make sure are an adequate supply to your plant. And you're going to recognize some of these from that bag of soil we were just talking about. So things like nitrogen, and phosphorus, and potassium. These are what we call the macronutrients that you normally see on a bag of fertilizer. And they'll typically be a number under those, and that number represents the percentage of the bag that this one particular element represents, or what's contained in that bag. So if I have and then fertilizers too are typically, you have what we call complete fertilizers, which means that there'll be a value under the N, under the P, and under the K. And if those three values are the same, then it's called a balanced fertilizer. And so in a case of say a 10-10-10 bag of balanced fertilizer, if that were a 10-pound bag, then the 10 under the nitrogen will represent 10% or 1 pound of nitrogen. And that's important if you're looking at the ingredients and how much a particular plant or a particular area you're trying to get onto the fertilizer, you'll understand what's actually contained in that bag. So before you plant, here's another little checklist that I'd like you guys to consider. If it's possible, first and foremost, again, I can't really stress this enough, is get your soil tested. Get a soil test done, and we'll talk a little bit about soil tests in just a minute here. And so, because you're going to be thinking about things like organic amendments and fertilizers, it's hard not to walk through a nursery right now and see all those beautifully colorful bags of fertilizers with tremendous fruit pictured on the front of them, and think to yourself, oh my gosh, I need to buy some of this. I need to put some of this in my garden because I want my plants to look like that. And and you can get there. You can do it. But what I want to do, and hopefully we accomplish this morning, is I want you to do it intelligently. And so, because sometimes what we don't realize, we're looking at this, is that there's a whole chemistry that's going on in that soil, and nature does a really, really good job of managing that chemistry for the most part. It's us as humans that get in there and mess it up. And so when we do these things and we add amendments or we add fertilizer, let's do it intelligently, because we are adding chemicals to an environment, and we want to make sure that when we're thinking about doing things like that we're mindful of the soil itself and the environment that's going on there that we talked about with that soil food web and that living soil. And we also want to be mindful of our broader environment and impacts that some of these chemicals could have in our waterways and to our air. So, which brings me to another point here, which is avoid heavy tilling. We were talking a little bit earlier, but one of the things that I have learned as the time that I've spent at our demonstration garden is we used to work a lot harder than we needed to work in a garden. We used to think that gardening was back-breaking, and perhaps it's something back in our ancestry that thought that we needed to be punished or something for working in a garden, and it doesn't need to be that way. Interestingly enough, and sometimes maybe we forget to think about it, but humans didn't start agriculture until about 10,000 years ago. There's 100 or so million years before that, the plants were doing just fine without our help, and so in some ways we sort of forget about that, and so we'll talk a little bit about that heavy tilling. But one of the things to think about when you think about heavy tilling is that beautiful illustration I showed you of the living soil. And imagine what happens when you go through with a great big old 20 horsepower Briggs & Stratton on that beautiful little environment that's under there. It's not good for all those guys. And so, and now is a good time too to think about if there are some excessive weeds in the garden, it's a good time to grab them and get them out, because we have had some nice weather, some warm weather, and those weeds are going to pop up, and more importantly, they're going to go to seed, and you want to prevent that from happening, because that's just going to create more work for you down the line. So, talking about soil testing. A soil test is really, really important. If you think about it, it's your starting point. Where am I starting from here? Again, it's so tempting to get sucked into the marketing of all those beautiful packages and think that this is something that you need. And maybe you do. Maybe your soil is deficient in some things, but maybe it's not. And so a soil test can actually save you some money. It may tell you that, hey, hold off. There's no need right now to be putting fertilizer necessarily into your soil. And so you kind of have two options on a soil test. We'll talk about how you can do it at home or get a lab test and what the differences are between the two and when it may be more appropriate to use one than the other. So if you've never done a soil test on your soil, I would recommend doing a lab soil test first. And the reason for these is the fact that they're very comprehensive. You look at this and don't let it overwhelm you. It's actually a pretty simple analysis. This happens to be from Peaceful Valley up in the Grass Valley area. They're a good nursery. We actually use them to do our soil tests. But there are others, and if you go to our website, we actually list lots of labs in the area to use. One thing I will say is once you use a lab, you should continue to use that same lab because all labs analyze soil differently. And so you might get different results from different labs. But what we're going to begin to do here is establish a baseline. And so it's something that you can watch over time. It's great. Now we have, I think we have 3 complete analyses like this done of the soil at our garden. And one of the things it's great to do is to begin to see how things change over time. And the other thing here is that, like I mentioned, not only will they show you what the current state is, but you'll also get a second page behind this with a list of recommendations. So what can you do? Because you might look at this and go, well, this is great, but what am I going to do about it? So, so here, I mean, you can see, and one of the things that when you do, if you reach out to one of these labs, they're going to send you a whole instruction packet in terms of what you need to do to take your soil samples. You want to take it in multiple places. They're also going to ask you, what is it you're growing? So that they can give you an accurate analysis and an accurate recommendation. So in this particular case, you can see along the bottom here, I mean, we have things like organic matter and nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium and all those that we know about, and even down into a lot of the micronutrients that we talked about before as being important. And then this little graph really kind of shows you that, I mean, this light blue area here is, you're going to be a little bit low. If you're in that green area, you're right in the sweet spot where you want to be. And if you're up in the red, then you're actually running really pretty high on those particular elements in your soil. So things that you want to think about is, if this were an analysis of my garden and I was looking at it, I would notice like this phosphorus being very, very high. And I mentioned that there's a lot of chemical reactions that are going on within your soil. And so if I were to think about what do I go out to, if I were going to add fertilizer to my garden, what would I add? Well, my phosphorus and my potassium are actually either higher or they're within a fine level. The only thing that's a little bit low here is nitrogen. So I might want to think about finding myself an organic fertilizer that is primarily nitrogen. So again, if I'm looking at that NPK, I want a value under the N, but a 0 and a 0 under the P and the K would be just fine. In fact, interestingly enough, in this particular case, this phosphorus level being as high as it is, one is that phosphorus, if it leaches out into our waterways, is one of the components that causes problems like algae bloom. And so you really want to be careful that if you are watering that, or when you begin to water, that the water doesn't leave your property, because you don't want these kinds of things to get into our waterway. Another thing that's really quite interesting is there there is actually an interaction that occurs in your soil between phosphorus and magnesium. Magnesium is critical for photosynthesis. And too much phosphorus in the soil can actually make it very difficult for your plants to absorb magnesium. And so in that particular case, your plants may not be thriving because they're not able to perform photosynthesis as well as they could, because that magnesium is being blocked from getting to your plants by this phosphorus. So adding more phosphorus here would actually be detrimental to your plants. Not, even over and above what we're talking about to our environment. So that's an important piece of it. Another thing that a lab test is going to give you is they're going to give you what is the pH of your soil. So pH is just a measure of how acidic or how alkaline any particular product happens to be. And so neutral, so the pH scale goes from 0 to 14. And a neutral pH, which is typically distilled water, human blood, things of that nature, would be 7. Most of our veggies like a slightly acidic soil, so that would be something a little bit less than 7. A lot of times, if you're looking at things like succulents and things like that, they may prefer a slightly more alkaline soil, and that would be a level above 7. So why do you care about that? Well, it's very interesting, but again, just talking about the vagaries of chemistry within your soil, is that when your pH is neutral, you can see that all these important elements that we've been talking about are available to your plants. As your soil becomes more acidic, that phosphorus, the potassium, the nitrogen, sulfur, calcium, those can all become more and more difficult for your plants to be able to absorb. And that's because of the chemical balance now being thrown off in your soil. So you really want to make sure that you're staying in this area here. And if that's off, what will happen is the results from that soil lab will give you recommendations in terms of how you can bring your soil back to this neutral level here. It's not a difficult thing to do, and it doesn't change quickly, but it's something that you want to make sure that you're aware of. So a soil lab test like that is going to run you between $50 and $60. Not a lot if you think about it. If it saves you actually buying a bag of fertilizer, it almost pays for itself. But it's something to think about. And if, like I said, if you haven't done a soil test, you haven't done one in several years, I would highly recommend thinking about doing a soil test from a laboratory. In the meantime, or if you just feel like you don't want to take on that expense, there are home soil test kits that they're similar to the photograph that I have here, and some provide pretty good results. As a matter of fact, 3 years ago, we had a soil test done, a lab soil test done at our demonstration garden, and I actually held back some of the soil that we sent to the lab and performed a soil test using just these little packets here. And when I measured those against the results that came back from the lab, I found that this measured the soil the results pretty accurately. And so these run about $20, and you can get about 10 tests out of them. And like I said, they can be generally pretty accurate. And so it's something to think about. And these run, like I said, maybe about $20. And but if you're going to get 10 tests out of it, that's a pretty low if you think about it. Making sure that you know what's going on in your soil and how you may want to amend it going forward. So you remember we talked about this and the fact that that your soil is half solids and half pore space. So one of the biggest issues in home gardens is what we call soil compaction. Okay, that's walking on the soil, that's heavy things being placed on the soil and things of that nature. And what that does is basically it takes that pore space and it squeezes it down. And in that particular case, then it's going to make it very, very difficult for your soil to hold water. And obviously it's going to make less airspace there for the oxygen for your plants and for the soil life. So one of the things you can do to take a look at this, very, very simple, is these little flags. You can see them. They're sold anywhere irrigation, garden irrigation is sold. You can find these. And what you can do is these little wires, just stick them in several places around your garden. And if you can get that little wire to go down 12 inches or more, then you don't have any issues with compaction, and you're going to be fine. If it gets from 4 to 12 inches, well, that's fair. And that's something that'll still work in your garden. But if that wire bends at 4 inches or less, then you've got an issue with compaction. So what do? Well, I mentioned that we really discourage rototilling and things of that nature unless it's absolutely necessary. But if you do it just once, try not to make it something that you do on a regular routine in your garden. But what you can do is use a fork like this. And in this particular case, what you're going to do, you can make sure you're using a garden fork and not a pitchfork. Pitchfork isn't heavy enough, and it's not going to be able to work for you. You'll just end up bending the tines. But you can use this kind of a garden fork. They usually have a little D handle on the top for you to hold on to. There's actually something else called a broad fork, which is just a kind of a giant version of this. Those are very, very heavy. And if you really need to bust up some soil, that they work great. But most of the time, I think this is going to work around here. So we're going to avoid heavy tilling with rototillers. And what you want to do here is you just want to push this fork into the soil, but don't turn the soil. Just gently lean that fork back and lift the soil. What you're trying to do is you're trying to reintroduce air into that and begin to separate some of that compacted soil. And then what you can do is you can just spread 3 to 4 inches of good aged compost over that and rake it across, and then let that work its way in. And one of the best things you can do then is in the fall is to think about planting a cover crop and letting the roots of a lot of plants do that heavy work for you. But this way you're not going to disturb the soil life that's in the soil, but you're actually going to help uncompact that soil, which is going to allow for that pore space and for your roots to really get established in your soil. So another one that can be a problem is drainage. And this can be caused by soil compaction. It can also be caused by just not having enough organic material in your soil. So a good little hack here is to dig yourself a hole about 1 foot by 1 foot and a foot deep. And take that soil and put it in a wheelbarrow and set that wheelbarrow in a shady spot, because I'm going to have you do something else with that soil as you're actually doing this work as well. And so you're going to kind of get a chance to take a look at two things on your in your garden here. So fill this with water, let it drain completely, and then I want you to refill it again. And I want you to take a ruler and I want you to measure how deep that water is. Okay, and then wait 15 minutes and then measure how much that water has dropped in 15 minutes. Now, because 15 minutes is a quarter of an hour, multiply the amount of inches that went down in 15 minutes by 4, and that'll tell you what your drainage rate is on an hourly basis. Okay. So too much water in your soil is going to push out that air. Remember, we saw that half of your soil is pore space, and of that it's divided pretty equally between air and water. Well, when a lot of water is in your soil, it's going to push the air out. And this is not necessarily uncommon. I mean, when we get a heavy rain or after irrigating a particular area in your garden, you might find that it's pretty wet for a little while, but that's okay, because as long as you have proper drainage, that ratio will return again. Okay, So in this particular case, ideally, what you'd like to see is water draining in about 2 inches per hour. If it's draining between 1 inch and 3 inches, then you're probably okay for the plants that you're thinking about putting in the garden. If it's less than 1 inch an hour, then it's moving too slowly, and you need to think about that aeration. So it's sort of go back to the previous slide and dig out that fork. If it's draining more than 3 inches an hour, then that's probably too fast. It means you've got a lot of sand in the soil. So either way, getting good organic material, compost into the soil is going to help, and it's going to help balance that out for you. But that's an important part of making sure as you're prepping your garden this year that you know what that drainage is doing in your garden. And then this last one's kind of fun. If you have children at home, grab them and they can help you with it. They'll probably really enjoy this. But that soil that you took from the hole that we did for our drainage test, making sure that it's at least 55 degrees or so when you're doing these things. Take that soil and like I mentioned, and then throw it into that wheelbarrow and then sift through that with your fingers and begin to count earthworms. And if you can find 10 earthworms in that soil, then that soil life that we've been talking about, it's a good indication that you've already got some pretty good healthy soil. So that's another quick, inexpensive, easy way to take a look at your soil and your soil health. So if you do decide that you're going to fertilize, you may come down to the question of, well, which fertilizer am I going to use? Am I going to use an organic fertilizer or a synthetic fertilizer? Okay. Well, really the big difference and what we try and help people understand is that organic fertilizers feed the soil. And it's the soil then that feeds the plant. Synthetic fertilizers will actually feed the plant directly. Now, there's times when both of these are good. If you have a very sickly plant that needs triage, certainly don't let the plant die because you don't want to use a synthetic fertilizer. A synthetic fertilizer is like a bolus, and it will give you almost immediate results that it will provide the nutrients that are already available for the plant to take up into its system through its roots. On an organic fertilizer, what you're going to rely upon are the microbes and the fauna in the soil to break down or mineralize this material in the fertilizer, and then they in turn will make it available in a plant available form that the plant can take up. So the difference here between the two is that it can take 2 to 6 weeks for this mineralization to occur. So if you're thinking about adding organic fertilizers to your garden, you want to think about getting those in the ground maybe 4 weeks, 5 weeks, depending on soil temperatures and just the conditions of your soil. And that way your soil will be ready when you do those transplants to actually assist the plant. But a spoiler alert here, I think it's always kind of fun, is that those elements, whether it's coming from your organic fertilizer or your synthetic fertilizer, a plant really doesn't care. It's really your choice. And if we think about sustainability and things of that nature, our first choice would always be to lean towards the organics. So in summary, planning is important. Thinking ahead of time, thinking right now about what you want to do with the soil that's in your garden. But the soil is the foundation of these things. And so it's very important to think about how you're treating that soil and what condition is that soil in. Soil testing, again, can't recommend it enough. It lets you know where your starting point is in the garden, and it can help you avoid putting chemicals in your garden that perhaps you don't need. And lastly, don't forget that the soil is half solids and half pore space. And that's an important part of soil that sometimes just doesn't get talked about enough. So I want to thank you guys for your time and your attention. Mentioned that I am part of the University of California's Master Gardener program, and there are Master Gardener programs in every Bay Area county, and we really are designed not to support big ag, but to support home gardeners. And so, we have staffed help desks that you can reach out to by email, by phone, and if you have specific problems, they're always there. We're ready, willing, and able to help you. And so if you are interested, if you have your phone, you can actually take a picture of that QR code there, and that'll take you to the statewide office, which in turn will show you the address for a local Master Gardener program in your area. So again, I thank you very much. Joan, I think we go back to you.
Great. Thanks, Mike. That was all very interesting. You don't often think of what goes on below the surface. And so it's very interesting. We don't have a lot of time left, but I'm going to try to grab a few questions that came in while you were talking. My neighbor has this issue too, but Cheryl asked, is there a certain amendment to add to the soil prior to planting to prevent bitterness in cucumbers and summer squash?
Ooh.
Is it the soil or maybe something else going on?
Yeah, it would be interesting. I'm gonna have to say that you kind of stumped me on that one. I haven't run across an issue with bitterness in squash or cucumbers personally, or at the demonstration garden. So, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of things that could happen, but it would be interesting to know what's causing that problem to the plant. But honestly, you've
that might be a good question to ask the help desk. And
it certainly would be a great question to ask them, because they can do that research.
Let's see, here's one that just popped up. Yvonne says, I have a lemon tree that has stopped producing lemons. Do you have any suggestions for her on that?
It's stopped producing, as I guess the question would be, was it producing and just stopped in the last few months, or because there could be just a host of things that could have happened. I think that one of the things I would do again would be to assess the soil around that lemon tree and make sure that the soil itself is in good shape, it hasn't gotten compacted or things of that nature, that there's still plenty of air and water that's moving through that soil. That's sometimes that can be a very simple thing. Just take a spade and dig down 8 inches or so into the soil and take a look at it. How's that soil feel? Is it especially dry? Was it especially hard to dig in? Those types of things. Certainly, one of those little home soil kits could be something that you look at and see if it's perhaps deficient in some nutrients. And also just check the plant itself and make sure that there isn't an issue going on with some type of a pathogen or a pest that may be in there that's causing some damage to the plant.
Yeah, a soil test would be good. I'm thinking maybe there's a problem with nitrogen or something.
It could be that it's just been depleted. Nitrogen, especially, is a very volatile chemical in your soil, and nitrogen would probably rather be anywhere than in your soil. So it likes to hitch a ride on water or any other way it can find to escape.
Yeah. Lynn says, I have 3 vegetable beds. I use the same soil and fertilizer on them. Should I test each bed, or will one give me the information I need for all of them?
If you're using those beds to plant the same veggies in or the same plants in, then taking a sample from each of them would be fine. We have quite a number of beds at the demonstration garden, but generally speaking, we take small samples from all of them and aggregate it together when we send in for our particular test. So unless you're going to be growing something unique in each of those beds where those plants may have different nutrient requirements, mixing them together should be just fine.
Jane asked, would you expect worms to be in a container vegetable garden?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. I get worms in mine. And, one thing I can say is I know you have to use different soil mixes in containers. But I'm kind of big on gardening hacks. I like little shortcuts and things that I can find where I can use them. But when you're preparing your containers, think about taking a nice big scoop of, if your soil in your ground or in those raised beds is healthy, take a scoop of that soil and actually go ahead and add it to your containers, because you're going to get some of the benefit of those minerals we talked about that native soil has that you don't necessarily get in planting mixes. And so in that particular case, it can actually add microbes and earthworms and things like that to your containers. And yeah, they'll be plenty happy there.
Bob says he's in Hollister and they have heavy clay soil. Right now it has cracks in it and is solid. What is the best way to approach this?
Build a raised bed. This is a tough one because, as I mentioned, you can, and again, it's one of those things that if you're just getting started, yeah, I mean, if you need to break out that great big rototiller and turn that soil, then by all means do it. But that's a one and done. And so after that, once you start building up the microbes and the life in the soil, you don't want to go back and tear it all up like that again. So that is a quick way. Get yourself a good load of, again, good quality aged compost. And if you're going to do that rototilling, go ahead and do it once and mix that organic material in with it, and that will improve the soil significantly. But then begin to create a routine. Make sure that there's always something planted in that soil. If you're not putting edible crops in, think about putting cover crops in. But you want to keep that soil productive, and you want something growing in it year round. Like I say, if it's really, really tough and you don't want to do that, I would definitely think about putting some raised beds on top of that soil.
Okay. Yes, we grow vegetables, in seasons, but we should always be growing our soil.
Absolutely. Yeah. Resting soil is a myth.
Yeah. Robert asked, how deep should you dig to get accurate samples for soil testing?
About 6 to 8 inches is plenty.
Okay. And Catherine asked, what's the difference between plant food and fertilizer?
That's an interesting question. I think it's marketing. There are companies that will market to you specialized fertilizers that they call plant foods. This one's specifically for tomatoes, or it's specifically for Japanese maples. And maybe in the case of acid-loving plants like blueberries or azaleas and things of that nature, looking at a plant food like that for a specific purpose is useful. But in general, what we try and do is encourage people to feed the soil, don't feed the plant. The soil will do a better job. The plant knows what it needs, and it's basically shopping from a menu. below the surface of that soil, that plant is actually sending out directions to the bacteria and the fungus, and it's actually shopping a menu, and it's taking what it needs. And so I think the best long-term approach is to think about feeding your soil.
I saw a question come up and I don't see it right now, so I can't tell you who asked it, but someone asked if they don't find worms in their beds, should they buy some and add them in?
I don't think that's necessary. I think really what would be more important is to get good, again, organic materials into the soil. Earthworms are kind of amazing. And one of the things too is you want to make sure that when you're hunting for those earthworms, as I mentioned, that the soil temperature is at least 55 degrees. If your soil is still colder than that, your earthworms have probably gone pretty deep into your soil because they want to protect themselves. I mean, these are not warm-blooded creatures. And so getting deeper into the soil provides more insulation and more protection from the cold. So if you think about some of these cold mornings, I'm sure the earthworms in my garden have gone way deep to protect themselves. So first off, make sure that the soil is warm enough so that there should be earthworm activity. But if you're not seeing it, because interestingly enough, a lot of worms and things like that are pretty particular about where they live. And so survive in your particular soil is another question altogether. So it may end up being a waste of money for you. But I've also found that the earthworm population seems to just multiply very, very quickly once they have something to eat. And so having those organics in the soil will sort of build it and they will come.
I think it's important to point out too that a lot of times you see worms for sale. Those are intended for worm composting bins.
Correct. Yes.
And they do not live in the soil. So if you put them out in your garden, you're going to just be killing them. Barbara asked for some growing tips for watermelon.
For watermelon, again, good quality soil. Make sure that you've got a very, very sunny place. Watermelons like a lot of heat. They like a lot of hours of sunshine. But aside from that, the soil itself doesn't really need to be any different than the soil you'd be using to grow pretty much any of your summer vegetables.
I think we have time for one more question. Cheryl says that she has a lot of pruned tree mulch from her tree guy that she's put all over her yard. Does she need to remove this before planting her veggies?
I mean, I would think that if it's as long as it's fairly shredded and small, it's going to be an excellent mulch. And again, in a drought like we're coming into, or it looks like we're coming into, you want to hang on to every bit of mulch that you can. So unless it's problematic and it's in the way or something, I would go ahead and leave it and just work around it.
Yeah, you can just push it aside to plant. Sure. And then bring it back. Okay, well, we still have a ton of questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I will be collecting them and I'll be doing either one story or several stories that tries to answer your specific questions. So Mike, I just want to thank you for your time this morning and all the great information. And I'm going to throw it back to Charnel.
Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Mike, for your presentation again. And I do want to thank everyone for joining us today for our Newsroom at Home episode. I do want to let everyone know that the webinar was recorded and we will be sending out an email with the recording link in the next couple of days or so. I'll also make sure to add the slides that Mike gave for his presentation as well, so that you guys have access to that. So moving on to our upcoming events, I do want to let you know that we have a couple coming up in March. Space Travel and Industry, that is a new one that we will be discussing on March 24th at 10 a.m. We'll sit down with an astronaut from the Bay Area, and he'll kind of talk about space travel and how space travel is a benefit to everyone in the world, really. So it should be an interesting one to hear from the astronaut. I do hope you guys join us for that one. And then, of course, we have Bookish with our sister company at SCNG. They'll be having another episode on March 18th at 5 p.m. So I hope you guys can also attend that as well. You can register for these events at mercurynews.com/events, eastbaytimes.com/events, and marinij.com/events. Also, I know a couple of people were asking about previous episodes. If you go to those websites, you can also see those previous gardening episodes or any episodes that you'd like on those websites. Again, that's mercurynews.com/events, eastbaytimes.com/events, or marinij.com/events. And then lastly, if you guys have any suggestions or ideas or topics that you want us to talk about, please go ahead and send them my way. You can send them to beevents@bayareanewsgroup.com. We're always looking for new topics. So again, if you have any ideas, go ahead and shoot me an email, and we'll see if we can get it incorporated into our series.